It begins with an irony so deep that history itself seems to smirk. The most feared Allied fighter of the Second World War, the sleek, lethal P-51 Mustang, was born not in the heart of Britain, nor in the skies over America, but in the mind of a German engineer. It's a paradox that almost defies belief. A man from Hitler's Germany designed the aircraft that would help bring Nazi Germany to its knees. The story of the Mustang isn't just about metal, engines, and aerodynamics. It's about human ingenuity, chance, and the strange twists of fate that define wartime invention. In 1940, the world was slipping into chaos. Europe was burning. France had fallen. Britain stood alone, battered nightly by Luftwaffe bombers, its skies a battlefield of survival. Across the Atlantic, America remained officially neutral, its industries humming with potential but still watching from the sidelines. Yet within that neutral nation, one company, North American Aviation, would take on a challenge that even seasoned engineers called impossible. The British were desperate. Their factories were strained to the breaking point. The Royal Air Force needed fighters. Fast. They approached North American Aviation not to invent, but simply to build. The plan was to have the company produce the existing Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license. It was a proven aircraft, rugged, dependable, but outdated. When the request reached WWII's president, James Kindleberger, his response was bold, almost reckless. Instead of copying the P-40, he promised to design a completely new fighter from scratch and deliver the first prototype in just 120 days. The idea sounded ludicrous. Even major firms took years to bring a fighter from drawing board to flight. But Kindleberger had something others didn't: a quiet, precise, brilliant man named Edgar Schmood. Born in Hornbach, Germany in 1899, Schmood grew up fascinated by flight. As a boy, he built model gliders from scraps of wood and cloth, watching them dance over the rolling hills of the Rhineland. Aviation was in its infancy, yet already he dreamed of designing aircraft that combined elegance and efficiency. After World War I, Germany was stripped of its ability to build warplanes, but Schmood's passion survived. He found work with Fokker, the Dutch aircraft firm with strong German ties, where he learned the subtle marriage of structure and aerodynamics. Later, he did design work connected to Messerschmitt, gaining insight into the sleek, high-performance fighters emerging in Europe. But Germany in the 1930s was changing fast. Politics, fear, and nationalism invaded every factory. Schmood, uncomfortable with the new regime, sought opportunity elsewhere. He emigrated first to Brazil, working on aircraft projects there before catching the attention of American executives. In the mid-1930s, he joined North American Aviation in California. To colleagues, he was the quintessential engineer, meticulous, obsessive, and quiet, yet with a spark of artistic vision. He believed that form and function were inseparable. If an airplane looked right, he said, it would fly right. That motto would soon become legend. When the British approached WWII in 1940, Schmood saw his chance to build something extraordinary. He and Kindleberger assembled a small, tireless team. Their challenge: create a fighter that could outperform the P-40, meet British specifications, and be ready in 4 months. They started with a blank sheet. There was no time for bureaucracy, no room for hesitation. In a temporary design office cluttered with pencils, slide rules, and cigarette smoke, the team worked night and day. Schmood sketched wing shapes on scraps of paper, calculating airflow and lift by hand. Draftsmen pinned enormous blueprints to the walls, adjusting every line for efficiency. The aircraft would become known internally as the NA-73X. Every part of it reflected Schmood's obsession with aerodynamic purity. The fuselage was narrow, the cockpit streamlined. The wing, his masterpiece, used a revolutionary laminar flow design. Instead of thick, bulging airfoils, these wings maintained a gentle curve, delaying turbulence and dramatically reducing drag. No operational fighter had ever flown with such wings before. It was a risk, but Schmood trusted the math and his intuition. He demanded flush rivets, eliminating the raised bumps that disturbed airflow on older planes. The engine sat low in the nose, giving the pilot excellent visibility and keeping the lines clean. Beneath the fuselage, he placed a deep radiator scoop, not just for cooling, but for thrust. Here lay one of his boldest ideas: the Meredith effect. By carefully shaping the duct and venting the heated air at high speed, the radiator could actually produce forward thrust, offsetting drag. To many engineers, it sounded like wishful thinking. To Schmood, it was simply physics, applied beautifully. As the days raced by, the impossible project took shape. Workers in the WWII plant bent metal late into the night, forging the sleek contours of the first prototype. Schmood walked the floor constantly, notebook in hand, inspecting every joint, every rivet. He wasn't just an engineer, he was an artist in aluminum. When someone questioned a curve or contour, he would simply say, "It looks right." That was enough. Against all expectations, on the 102nd day, the NA-73X rolled out of the hangar, a gleaming silver bird with long, graceful wings and the promise of something entirely new. The first flight took place on October 26, 1940. Test pilot Vance Breezy lifted the plane off the ground, and for the briefest moment, history held its breath. The Mustang, though it wasn't yet called that, flew smoothly, fast, and effortlessly. Breezy landed with a grin. It handled beautifully, yet the road ahead was far from smooth. The aircraft used an Allison V1710 engine, reliable but designed for low altitude performance. Above 15,000 feet, its power dropped sharply. In early tests, the British liked the Mustang's handling but found it disappointing at high altitudes, the very arena where the war in Europe was being fought. Schmood knew the airframe had untapped potential, it only needed the right heart. Still, for a design conceived in desperation, the Mustang was a triumph. It could outrange, outmaneuver, and outfly anything in its class at low to medium altitudes. British pilots used it effectively for reconnaissance and ground attack missions, praising its speed and range. But Schmood wasn't satisfied. He envisioned an aircraft that could go toe-to-toe with the best German fighters at any height. In late 1942, a new idea began circulating among British engineers and American liaisons. What if they replaced the Allison with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine powering the legendary Spitfire? The Merlin delivered superb high-altitude performance, and its supercharger transformed an aircraft's potential. The notion seemed simple, yet the impact would be revolutionary. When the first Mustang fitted with a Merlin engine roared down the runway, the transformation was instantaneous. Its climb rate, top speed, and service ceiling skyrocketed. Suddenly, the Mustang wasn't just a good plane, it was a world beater. The P-51B and C variants entered service in 1943, followed soon by the refined P-51D with its bubble canopy and long-range drop tanks. These machines could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, began to crumble under relentless Allied air pressure. Mustang pilots, affectionately calling themselves the Little Friends, guarded bomber formations across Europe. Before their arrival, losses among bombers had been catastrophic. With the P-51, those losses plummeted. The sky, once ruled by the German Eagle, now belonged to the Mustang. For Schmood, it was both vindication and irony made flesh. His creation, born of mathematics and instinct, had become the scourge of his homeland's Air Force. When photographs of Mustangs escorting bombers over Germany reached Allied papers, few realized that the aircraft's designer had been born on German soil. To Schmood, nationality mattered less than excellence. He often said he felt entirely American. The Mustang, to him, was America's gift to freedom. By war's end, the P-51 had proven itself not only as a fighter, but as a symbol of collaboration, of ingenuity, of what could be achieved when design and daring met under impossible circumstances. When the P-51 Mustang entered the war in strength, it did more than alter the balance of power in the skies. It transformed the entire philosophy of air combat. Before its arrival, bomber missions deep into German territory were near suicidal. Flying fortresses and liberators could reach their targets, but they couldn't survive without escorts. Fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning had limited range, often forced to turn back while bombers pressed on alone into a sky filled with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The result was devastating. Thousands of bomber crews lost, entire formations torn apart over Europe. The Mustang changed all of that. With its laminar flow wing and efficient aerodynamics, combined with drop tanks and the mighty Merlin engine, it could escort bombers from England to Berlin to the industrial heart of Germany and all the way back again. For the first time, the Allied air campaign had true continuity of protection. Bomber crews began to notice something remarkable. The formations were coming home with fewer empty seats. When the Mustangs appeared on the horizon, pilots cheered. They called them angels with propellers. From a design standpoint, Schmood's masterpiece had achieved something no other fighter had done so perfectly before. It married speed, range, maneuverability, and firepower into a single elegant form. It wasn't just fast, it was efficient. Its wings sliced through the air with surgical precision, conserving energy and fuel even at high throttle. The Meredith effect radiator not only cooled the engine but actually contributed a few hundred pounds of thrust at high speed, turning what was normally a necessary drag penalty into an aerodynamic advantage. Every inch of the aircraft seemed to whisper of calculated grace. Schmood, though now a senior figure at North American Aviation, never treated the Mustang as a finished product. He was obsessed with refinement. As reports came back from the field, he analyzed each complaint, gun jams, canopy visibility, tail instability, and turned them into improvements. The early B and C models, though formidable, still suffered from limited rear visibility due to their framed canopies. Schmood's solution was the P-51D, the definitive Mustang, with its distinctive bubble canopy that gave the pilot nearly 360-degree vision. That small change saved countless lives in dogfights where a second's warning meant survival. But behind every elegant design lay the brutal context of war. The same German skies Schmood once admired as a boy now burned with the thunder of his creation. Mustang pilots tore through Luftwaffe formations with deadly precision. Dogfights erupted over the ruins of cities he once called home. It's said that Schmood never spoke publicly about his feelings toward that irony, but those who knew him sensed a quiet melancholy. He had designed beauty, but beauty in war is always shadowed by loss. The Mustang's impact on strategy cannot be overstated. Before its arrival, Allied bombing was limited to selective raids, often at night or along the edges of occupied Europe. With the P-51's arrival, the Allies could launch continuous daylight assaults deep into the Reich. Entire industrial centers, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, aircraft factories became vulnerable. The Luftwaffe was forced to rise and fight every day, bleeding pilots it could no longer replace. The German High Command watched helplessly as its once invincible air arm disintegrated under relentless pressure. For the pilots who flew it, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a partner, a living thing that seemed to understand. Pilots often said it flew as though it knew what you wanted. The controls were light, responsive, perfectly balanced. At high speed, where other aircraft became heavy and stubborn, the Mustang remained nimble, elegant. In combat, that meant life or death. It could climb and dive with breathtaking agility, roll into turns so smoothly that German pilots often underestimated its reach. Many Luftwaffe aces reported engaging Mustangs only to find themselves outturned and outclimbed before realizing what had happened. One of the Mustang's greatest advantages was psychological. To German fighter pilots, seeing the long-nosed silhouette meant trouble. Its presence sapped morale. To Allied crews, it was hope incarnate. Many bomber crews painted Mustangs on their fuselages as talismans of luck, the mark of their protectors. Stories spread of P-51 pilots who stayed with crippled bombers all the way back across the channel, nursing them home on dwindling fuel, sometimes sacrificing their own safety. The bond between bomber and fighter crews became legendary, encapsulated in the nickname Little Friends. Schmood followed these reports with both pride and humility. He never sought fame, never claimed to have changed history. Yet in every technical drawing he approved and every curve he defended from alteration, he had shaped the outcome of the war. His design wasn't born of military ideology or nationalistic fervor, but of an engineer's simple pursuit of perfection. To him, good design was universal, free of borders, politics, or propaganda. Ironically, that purity of purpose made the Mustang one of the deadliest instruments of war. By 1944, the P-51D was rolling off assembly lines in enormous numbers. American industry, once hesitant, was now in full swing. Schmood oversaw not only production, but also the integration of constant minor refinements, better gun sights, improved radios, more durable landing gear. Each enhancement made the Mustang a more formidable predator. Allied air groups equipped with P-51s began to dominate European skies so thoroughly that German planners called it the Skynet. Even the feared Me-262 jet fighter, Germany's technological marvel, found itself vulnerable during takeoff and landing phases, when Mustangs would swoop in to destroy them before they could escape into the clouds. The statistics told a story of their own. Between late 1943 and mid-1945, bomber loss rates plummeted by more than half. Luftwaffe fighter kills rose into the thousands, but German replacements dwindled. Entire squadrons were decimated. The P-51, sleek and silver, had become the symbol of inevitability, the harbinger that Germany's air dominance was over. Yet for all its wartime glory, the Mustang also embodied something deeper, the collaboration of nations that had once been rivals. Its airframe was American, its engine British, and its designer German-born. In a sense, it was a microcosm of what the Allied war effort represented: diverse minds united by necessity, guided by genius. Schmood often reflected privately that the Mustang's creation was proof of what humanity could achieve when competition gave way to cooperation, even under the shadow of global conflict. As the war drew toward its violent end, the Mustang's legacy was already secured. It had fought over Normandy, over the Ardennes, over the ruins of Berlin. It had escorted bombers that destroyed the German war machine and cleared the path for D-Day. But it had also written a new chapter in aviation history, a chapter that would define how fighters were designed for decades to come. Schmood, though quietly proud, remained restless. He was a man who believed perfection was a moving target. When others celebrated victory, he analyzed flaws. How could the aircraft be lighter, faster, more stable at transonic speeds? His restless curiosity would soon carry him into the jet age. But for now, the Mustang was his triumph, the proof that a line on paper could change the course of history. When peace finally returned, pilots often described the strange emptiness that followed. They missed the roar of engines, the smell of oil, the bond between man and machine that only war had forged. Many bought surplus Mustangs after the war, flying them in air races or preserving them as symbols of courage and innovation. Even decades later, the sight of a P-51 slicing through the sky stirred something primal in those who watched. Its sound, a high, clean whine of the Merlin engine, became music to veterans' ears, a song of victory and remembrance. In the post-war years, Schmood's story might have faded quietly into the archives of aviation history, if not for the enduring fascination with the Mustang. Journalists and historians began tracing the aircraft's origins, discovering that its genius had come from an unlikely source. When asked about his heritage, Schmood would smile faintly and say, "I'm an American engineer who happened to be born in Germany." It was his way of drawing a line between past and present. The nation that once birthed him had plunged the world into darkness. The one he adopted had helped bring light back. The irony was undeniable. Somewhere in those closing years of the war, as P-51 swept across the skies of Bavaria, Schmood's homeland trembled beneath the thunder of his creation. Towns that once inspired his childhood dreams now looked up at the wings he had designed. He never gloated, never expressed satisfaction in that reversal. For him, it was simply the cruel symmetry of history. How genius, once set in motion, could serve causes far beyond the control of its creator. In the aftermath of the war, the P-51 Mustang's legend didn't fade, it evolved. Across the world, it became the gold standard by which every other piston-engine fighter would be judged. Its silhouette graced posters, training manuals, and airfields from Europe to the Pacific. Even pilots who had never flown one could describe its sound and its shape. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was the symbol of Allied victory, of American industrial power, and of human imagination triumphing over constraint. Yet at the center of this story remained one man whose name most people didn't know: Edgar Schmood. He wasn't the type to seek headlines or pose for photographs beside his creation. While generals and politicians gave speeches, Schmood returned to his drafting table, sketching new ideas, refining aerodynamics, and thinking of the future. To him, the Mustang was not the culmination of his career, but a step, a demonstration of what could be achieved through precision, logic, and daring imagination. In 1946, Schmood and his team began experimenting with new concepts. The jet age had arrived, and propellers were quickly becoming relics. For most designers, the transition from piston to jet power was an intimidating leap. But for Schmood, it was simply another problem to solve. The same aerodynamic principles applied, he reasoned. Only the energy source had changed. He had proven with the Mustang that aerodynamics could transform a machine's performance. Now he sought to apply that same philosophy to the next generation of aircraft. His first major post-war contribution came with the F-86 Sabre, North American aviation's first jet fighter. Though not solely his design, Schmood's fingerprints were all over it: the swept wings, the clean lines, the aerodynamic finesse. The Sabre would go on to dominate the skies over Korea, earning a reputation much like the Mustangs in World War II. Pilots even remarked that it felt like a jet-powered Mustang, agile and intuitive, which was no coincidence. Schmood's mantra, "If it looks right, it flies right," guided the entire project. Meanwhile, the Mustang itself continued to serve long after the war ended. It became the frontline fighter for dozens of air forces worldwide. In Korea, it was reborn as a fighter bomber, strafing enemy positions with the same precision it once used against Nazi trains and convoys. Its range and versatility made it ideal for ground attack missions in terrain where jets couldn't yet operate safely. Schmood often marveled that his impossible wartime design had outlived its original purpose by a decade or more. The aircraft had matured gracefully, like a weapon ahead of its time. But behind every triumph, there is always the quiet burden of reflection. For Schmood, that reflection was personal. The world had changed dramatically since his youth in Germany. The nation that had once been home to pioneering engineers, von Ohain, Heinkel, Messerschmitt, was now divided, its cities shattered, its spirit broken. Schmood had left before the war's full fury, but he couldn't entirely separate himself from what Germany had become. In quiet moments, he sometimes wondered how his life might have unfolded had he stayed. Would he have been conscripted into designing machines for the Reich? Would he have resisted? No one knew, not even him. But fate had spared him that moral compromise. His decision to emigrate had given him something else, the freedom to create without ideology. In America, innovation was celebrated, not constrained by politics. The P-51 had proven that when engineers were trusted with vision and autonomy, they could reshape the world. Schmood's design philosophy spread quietly through North American aviation's culture. Younger engineers admired his patience and precision. He demanded elegance, not through flamboyance, but through logic. When asked how he conceived the Mustang's proportions, he famously replied, "I draw what the air wants to see." Those words encapsulated something profound, a harmony between science and art that few could articulate. Schmood's genius wasn't in raw mathematics alone, though he mastered that too. It was in intuition, the ability to feel how air would flow, how lift would behave, how stability would emerge from beauty. To him, an airplane was not just a tool of war, but a sculpture in motion, one that had to seduce the wind rather than fight it. That philosophy became the invisible signature of his career. As post-war aviation accelerated, new designers often sought to push boundaries purely through power, bigger engines, faster jets, higher altitudes. Schmood, ever the minimalist, believed that power meant nothing without harmony. He once remarked to a colleague that a poor design with a great engine will always lose to a great design with a decent engine. The P-51 had proven him right. Its Merlin engine was extraordinary, but without the airframe's perfect balance, it would never have achieved its legend. By the early 1950s, Schmood was supervising multiple projects, each more advanced than the last. The F-86 Sabre became the backbone of Western air forces, dueling MiG-15s over Korea in spectacular dogfights that echoed the duels of the previous war. When American pilots reported that the Sabre handled like a dream, Schmood quietly smiled. His design DNA lived on in every roll, every bank, every high-speed dive. It was proof that beauty and performance were two sides of the same principle. Even as jets replaced propellers, the Mustang refused to die. Air racers across the United States bought surplus P-51s for a fraction of their original cost, modifying them for extreme speed. They stripped out armor, polished the aluminum, and tuned the Merlins to roar louder than ever. The result was breathtaking. Mustangs tearing across desert courses at over 500 miles per hour, their wings shimmering like silver, blades in the sun. Spectators cheered, veterans wept, and Schmood watched from a distance, amused that his wartime fighter had become a peacetime champion. In air shows and museums, the Mustang's presence was magnetic. Children pressed their faces to the glass, tracing the elegant curves. Pilots, old and young, agreed there was something almost human about it, as though the machine itself possessed a spirit, the soul of the engineer who created it and the pilots who flew it. Schmood never denied that connection. He often described the Mustang as alive. As the Cold War took hold, the world's attention shifted toward new threats and new technologies. Jet bombers, guided missiles, and nuclear deterrence dominated military budgets. Yet amid all the futuristic weaponry, the Mustang remained beloved. In smaller air forces, in Latin America, Asia, and even parts of Europe, it continued to serve loyally, patrolling borders and training new generations of pilots. Some P-51s flew into the 1970s, long after Schmood himself had moved on to new designs. Despite his success, Schmood lived modestly. He was not interested in wealth or fame. Those who worked with him recalled a man who arrived early, stayed late, and treated every drawing as though it were the first. He carried a slide rule in his pocket well into the age of calculators. He preferred quiet conversations about design to public ceremonies. When awards came, he accepted them politely and returned to work. What mattered to him was not recognition but precision, the satisfaction of knowing he had achieved a perfect line, a flawless curve. As time passed, historians began to reevaluate his place in aviation history. They realized that while others were credited with daring innovations, Schmood's influence was subtler but more profound. He had not only built one of the greatest fighters ever made, but also redefined what aircraft design could be, a synthesis of art and engineering. His approach laid the foundation for generations of designers who followed, from the jet age to the dawn of stealth. When journalists asked him late in life what made the P-51 special, Schmood gave a characteristically understated reply: "It did everything well." That simple sentence captured what engineers strive for but rarely achieve: balance. The Mustang didn't rely on one overwhelming advantage. It was the sum of many small perfections. Range, speed, stability, control. Each element harmonized until the result felt inevitable, as though it could never have been built any other way. The irony remained, of course. A man who left Germany to escape its darkness had helped design the weapon that pierced its skies and hastened its downfall. But Schmood never saw it in political terms. He saw it as the triumph of reason over chaos, of precision over ideology. To him, the Mustang was proof that knowledge, when freed from fear, could become a force for liberation rather than destruction. By the mid-1950s, the world that had birthed the P-51 Mustang was disappearing. Jet engines screamed where propellers once hummed. Supersonic flight, guided missiles, and radar-controlled interception were transforming the skies into something alien to the old pilots of the war. Yet the Mustang still appeared at air bases and small airports across the world, a shimmering reminder of an era when victory depended on courage, intuition, and the steady hand of a designer who understood that simplicity could be sublime. Edgar Schmood, now in his 50s, was at the height of his powers. He had spent nearly 2 decades inside the American aviation industry and had become one of its quiet legends. At North American Aviation, his word carried the weight of experience. Younger engineers sought his approval like artists, showing sketches to a master. But even in his senior position, Schmood remained what he had always been, a craftsman. He sat at his drafting table, sleeves rolled, slide rule gleaming, drawing careful arcs and cross-sections by hand. He distrusted automation. To him, the human touch was not a flaw in engineering, but its soul. Around this time, he began work on another ambitious fighter, the F-100 Super Sabre, the first American jet capable of sustained supersonic flight. It was a direct descendant spiritually of the Mustang, sleek, powerful, and elegant. The F-100 carried forward many of the principles Schmood had lived by: clean aerodynamics, balance between speed and control, and a design that looked as though it were born to fly fast. When the first Super Sabre broke the sound barrier in level flight, Schmood's colleagues congratulated him as if history had repeated itself. Once again, his understanding of form and flow had ushered in a new frontier. But unlike the P-51, the Super Sabre belonged to an era of tension, not open war. It was a weapon built for deterrence, part of the vast machinery of the Cold War. Schmood, who had lived through one global conflict and contributed indirectly to another's shadow, often reflected on how technology could both preserve and endanger humanity. To him, design was neutral. Only people gave it meaning. He sometimes told young engineers that a beautiful machine is only as noble as the hands that command it. Despite his growing influence, Schmood remained an outsider in temperament. His accent never completely vanished, a trace of his German childhood lingering in the measured cadence of his speech. Yet within the American aerospace community, that background no longer mattered. To them, he was as American as his airplanes, a citizen of innovation, unbound by birthplace. Meanwhile, the P-51's legend only deepened. Veterans who had flown it began publishing memoirs, their pages filled with affection for the plane that had carried them through the fire of war. They wrote of how it responded like a living thing, how it seemed to anticipate their thoughts. One pilot described it as a faithful horse that never refused the charge. Another wrote that when he flew the Mustang, he felt closer to the air itself than any man should be. These words reached Schmood through magazines and letters, each one reminding him that his creation had outgrown him. It no longer belonged to engineers or factories. It belonged to history. Air shows in the 1950s and 60s kept the legend alive. Crowds gasped as restored Mustangs roared overhead, their Merlin engines echoing across fields and cities. For veterans, the sound was a time machine. It carried them back to freezing cockpits over Europe, to the endless roar of combat, to the strange mixture of fear and exhilaration that defined youth at war. Schmood often attended these events quietly, standing at the edge of the crowd. When people learned who he was, they would shake his hand in awe. He would smile politely, perhaps offer a modest "thank you," and then look skyward, watching his creation dance one more time in the air it was born for. As the years passed, the P-51 became more than a warplane. It became an icon of design, studied in universities, displayed in museums, and revered by engineers as a model of efficiency. Aeronautical textbooks dissected its laminar flow wing and its thrust-producing radiator, marveling at how something conceived in the heat of war had achieved such enduring perfection. The Mustang was, in many ways, a machine ahead of its time, proof that brilliance can emerge even under the most desperate conditions. For Schmood, that endurance was both gratifying and humbling. He often said that an engineer's greatest reward was not fame, but longevity, to know that one's work continued to live, breathe, and inspire long after its purpose had been fulfilled. The Mustang had done exactly that. It had survived the war, transcended its origins, and become a symbol of something universal. The idea that imagination, when guided by discipline, can change the world. In interviews, Schmood sometimes spoke about the early days at North American Aviation, when the British order had first arrived and everyone thought the deadline impossible. He would smile at the memory of sleepless nights, the clatter of slide rules, and the team's unwavering focus. "We didn't think about failure," he said once. "We didn't have time." That single sentence captured the spirit of the Mustang's creation, urgency transformed into innovation. The irony of Schmood's life continued to intrigue journalists. How could a German-born engineer create one of the Allies' most effective weapons? Some assumed guilt or contradiction, but those who knew him well dismissed such speculation. Schmood had left Germany before it became a prison of ideology. His genius had flourished precisely because he was free. The Mustang, they said, was not an American airplane designed by a German, but a human achievement designed by a free man. As aviation moved into the space age, Schmood's name began to appear alongside those of pioneers like Kelly Johnson and Clarence Kelly Bell, men who shaped the post-war aerospace revolution. Yet Schmood never sought to compete. He admired others' innovations, from the sleek lines of the U-2 spy plane to the thunderous power of the F-104 starfighter. What mattered to him was not whose name adorned the project, but whether the airplane captured that elusive harmony between necessity and beauty. Late in his career, Schmood joined Northrop, where he continued to design advanced aircraft concepts. Even in his 60s and 70s, he approached every new challenge with the same quiet intensity he had brought to the Mustang decades earlier. Younger colleagues were astonished by his memory. He could recall measurements, stress tolerances, and material behaviors from memory, as though the physics of flight had become part of his bloodstream. He would gently correct draftsmen's calculations, then sketch a better curve with a few strokes of a pencil. Watching him work was like witnessing history in motion. Through all the changes in technology, from piston to jet, from aluminum to titanium, Schmood's core philosophy never wavered. "Good design," he often said, "is eternal." And the proof of that truth was still roaring through the skies at every air show, wearing its polished silver skin like armor from a forgotten age. Even in retirement, he remained deeply connected to aviation. Friends recalled that he could spend hours standing near a runway, simply watching planes take off and land. He would study their angles, their movements, their wing shapes. Sometimes he'd shake his head, murmuring to himself, "Too heavy in the tail," or "too much drag in the intake." He could see flaws invisible to others, as though his eyes measured lift and drag instinctively. To him, flight was never routine. It was still a miracle. By the time the 1960s gave way to the 70s, Schmood had become something of a legend within engineering circles, though the wider public knew little of him. But those who built planes, those who flew them, and those who studied them understood his place in history. He was the man who had turned an impossible deadline into a masterpiece that changed the world. By the time Edgar Schmood reached his later years, the world around him had changed almost beyond recognition. The same sky that had once thundered with propellers now echoed with the supersonic booms of jet fighters streaking past at twice the speed of sound. Men were walking on the moon, and computers were beginning to replace the human hand in drafting rooms. Yet amid all these revolutions, Schmood still believed in the simple elegance of a well-drawn curve and a perfectly balanced wing. He often told younger engineers that no matter how advanced technology became, the air doesn't change. Its laws were the same as they had been when the Wright brothers first took flight, and those who understood those laws intuitively would always have an advantage. Though he had never been one for public attention, by the late 1960s, aviation historians began seeking him out for interviews. They wanted to understand the mind behind the Mustang, the aircraft that had become legend. Schmood would meet them in his modest office, surrounded by old drafting tools, models of aircraft, and worn notebooks filled with calculations in neat handwriting. When asked about the Mustang's creation, he would smile faintly and say, "It was a team effort." He gave credit to Kindleberger for leadership, to the British for their trust, and to his engineers for their endurance. But those who listened closely could hear the quiet pride beneath his humility. He knew that the Mustang bore his fingerprint on every line, every contour. When he spoke about design, his language was more poetic than technical. He described wings as music written in air, the fuselage as the spine of a bird, and balance as the moment when nature agrees with mathematics. To hear him talk about airplanes was to realize that he didn't merely build machines, he gave them character. He believed that a good airplane was an extension of its pilot's soul, and that beauty in flight came from the marriage of human instinct and mechanical grace. Throughout the 1970s, the Mustang's fame only grew. Air museums across America competed to restore original models. Pilots and collectors hunted for derelict airframes hidden in barns or abandoned airstrips, rebuilding them piece by piece. The war had ended decades earlier, yet the Mustang refused to fade into history. It became a bridge between generations, a reminder that even in the darkest hours of humanity, creation could emerge from destruction. Schmood attended several dedications quietly, usually invited as a guest of honor. At one event, an elderly bomber pilot approached him, shaking his hand with tears in his eyes. "You saved my life," the man said simply. "If your plane hadn't been there, I wouldn't be standing here." Schmood, touched but awkward with emotion, could only nod. That moment, repeated countless times throughout his later life, reminded him that the P-51 was more than an engineering achievement. It was, quite literally, a lifesaver. As decades rolled on, the myth of the P-51 began to eclipse the memory of the world it came from. For young aviation enthusiasts, the war was distant history, but the Mustang was timeless. They saw it as the purest expression of flight, fast, balanced, and beautiful. Many compared it to a Stradivarius violin, old, handcrafted, yet impossible to surpass. Engineers studying it found themselves humbled by how perfectly it embodied aerodynamic principles with the limited tools of the 1940s. No computers, no simulations, only human intellect, intuition, and sheer perseverance. When asked how such perfection had been achieved under the pressure of war, Schmood explained it simply. "We didn't have time to make mistakes." The urgency of the 120-day deadline had forced clarity. There was no room for unnecessary wait, no time for over-engineering. Every line had to serve a purpose, every rivet had to justify its existence. The result was not only efficiency but elegance, the kind of beauty that emerges only when necessity strips away excess. That philosophy, that perfection arises from constraint, became one of Schmood's enduring lessons to future generations. He warned against over-reliance on machines and complex systems. "Computers can calculate," he would say, "but they cannot imagine." His students and colleagues often repeated that quote long after his death. To Schmood, imagination was the spark that transformed knowledge into creation. It was the same spark that had driven him to sketch the Mustang's wing on scrap paper in 1940, believing it would work simply because it felt right. Even in his later years, Schmood continued to design. At Northrop, he contributed to advanced jet concepts and even early stealth-related studies, though he never sought recognition for them. His mind remained restless, always searching for refinement. Colleagues remembered that he would spend hours discussing wing sweep angles or control surface harmonics, sketching solutions by hand even when others had moved on to digital tools. It wasn't stubbornness, it was trust in the tactile connection between mind and pencil. Outside of work, Schmood lived quietly. He enjoyed painting, classical music, and long walks. He was not a man of extravagance. Friends said that he seemed most at peace near airfields, where he could watch planes take off and disappear into the horizon. He often remarked that the sound of an engine at full power was the heartbeat of progress. When journalists asked him late in life if he had ever felt conflicted about his heritage, about being German by birth but designing a weapon that devastated Germany, he paused thoughtfully before answering. "I designed an airplane," he said. "What others used it for was history." It was a simple statement, but it carried layers of meaning. Schmood understood that creation and destruction were intertwined, that engineers rarely control the destiny of their inventions. Yet in his heart, he believed the Mustang had served a just cause, one that liberated rather than enslaved. By the 1980s, the Mustang had become a cultural icon beyond aviation circles. It appeared in films, documentaries, and air shows worldwide. When the movie Empire of the Sun featured Mustangs strafing a Japanese airfield, audiences cheered at the sight of their gleaming wings. Even decades after the war, the P-51 still stirred something deep within people. It represented freedom, victory, and the enduring human desire to master the sky. Schmood, now in his 80s, saw this with quiet satisfaction. He had lived long enough to see his creation become immortal. In interviews, he often deflected praise, reminding people that it was the pilots who gave the Mustang its soul. "They made it great," he said. "We only built the bones." But those who studied him knew that without his vision, those pilots would never have had the wings that carried them home. As the century neared its close, Edgar Schmood's health began to decline, but his mind remained sharp. Even from his hospital bed, he would talk about design, about balance and proportion. To the nurses who didn't know his history, he was just an elderly engineer with a German accent and an endless fascination with airplanes. To those who did know, he was something more. The man who had built a legend. In his final years, Edgar Schmood often reflected on the strange journey that had carried him from a small village in Germany to the heart of American aviation. He had lived through 2 world wars, seen technology leap from wood and fabric to supersonic jets, and watched his own designs carve their names into the sky. Yet, for all his achievements, he remained remarkably grounded. He didn't own a large estate or drive expensive cars. He preferred simplicity, perhaps because he knew that the most beautiful things in life, like flight itself, depended on balance rather than extravagance. He would sometimes reminisce with colleagues about those frantic months in 1940, when North American aviation had promised to build the Mustang in 120 days. Even 40 years later, the memory remained vivid. The sleepless nights, the smell of machine oil, the sound of pencils scratching over blueprints. It had been a time of pressure and passion unlike any other. "We didn't know if it would work," he admitted once, "but we believed it had to." That belief, that combination of necessity and faith in design, had carried them through. By the late 1980s, aviation historians began to describe the P-51 Mustang as the most successful propeller-driven fighter ever built. The Smithsonian Institution restored one to pristine condition, its polished aluminum gleaming under museum lights. Visitors stood in awe before it, imagining what it must have been like to fly such a machine. Children asked their parents if it was a spaceship. Veterans would stand quietly, sometimes saluting. Schmood visited the exhibit once, standing before his creation as if meeting an old friend. He touched the cool metal gently and said, almost to himself, "Still beautiful." His humility never waned, but those who worked with him understood that behind that modest demeanor was fierce pride. He knew what the Mustang had achieved, not just in combat, but in the evolution of flight itself. It had proven that efficiency, when married to artistry, could accomplish miracles. And perhaps more importantly, it had shown that collaboration across nations could produce something greater than any one country could build alone. In many ways, Schmood's life mirrored the very design principles he championed. He sought equilibrium between his past and his present, between ambition and restraint, between art and science. He was proud of his German heritage, but grateful for the freedom America had given him. He often said that the United States had allowed him to think without fear, a statement that revealed the weight of his memories from pre-war Europe. That freedom of thought had been the wind beneath his wings, enabling him to turn ideas into history. Even as the years caught up with him, Schmood remained a mentor. Young engineers would visit him, bringing questions, models, and even small design problems. He would study their sketches in silence, then make a few simple corrections that transformed the entire concept. His sense of proportion was almost instinctive, as though he could feel the invisible forces of lift and drag tugging at his fingertips. He would tell them stories from the Mustang days, how a misplaced rivet could change airflow, how the slightest curve could turn drag into thrust. "The air is honest," he would say. "It will tell you when you're wrong." That phrase became something of a motto among the engineers who admired him. The air is honest. It meant that nature doesn't lie. Equations could be manipulated, opinions could be debated, but when an airplane met the sky, only truth remained. If it flew well, the design was right. If it didn't, no excuses mattered. It was a simple creed, yet it contained the essence of every great engineer's philosophy. When Edgar Schmood passed away in 1985, tributes poured in from around the world. Pilots, engineers, historians, and aviation enthusiasts all spoke of the man whose vision had changed flight forever. Many called him the Leonardo da Vinci of aerodynamics, a man who blended science with intuition so perfectly that his creations seemed almost alive. North American Aviation, by then part of a much larger aerospace conglomerate, released a statement honoring him as a designer whose work transcended time, whose aircraft embodied both art and excellence. At his funeral, a small formation of restored P-51 Mustangs flew overhead in tribute. Their engines roared in perfect harmony, circling once, before disappearing into the clouds. Those who were present said the sound brought tears to their eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. It was as if the airplanes themselves had come to say farewell to the man who gave them life. In the years that followed, Schmood's legacy only grew stronger. The P-51 became a fixture at air shows, a symbol of the golden age of flight. Every generation rediscovered it anew, marveling at how something designed in the crucible of war could still embody such grace and power. Pilots described the feeling of flying one as transformative. "You don't fly the Mustang," one said. "You become part of it." Historians began to study Schmood's design process in detail, uncovering notes, blueprints, and personal letters. They were astonished by how forward-thinking his concepts had been. He had anticipated aerodynamic principles that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. His use of laminar flow, his integration of thrust recovery from radiator heat, his insistence on smooth airflow over every surface, all were ideas years ahead of their time. Even modern aerospace engineers admitted that the Mustang's efficiency was hard to surpass. For all its fame, the story of the Mustang was still, at its heart, a story about one man's belief in possibility. Schmood had taken what others called impossible, designing and building a fighter in 120 days, and turned it into reality. He had done so not with supercomputers or endless budgets, but with intellect, discipline, and a belief in beauty as a functional principle. His achievement stands as a reminder that innovation often begins with defiance, the refusal to accept that something cannot be done. Long after his death, journalists continued to explore the deeper symbolism of Schmood's story. The irony of his origins, a German-born engineer creating the aircraft that helped defeat Nazi Germany, remained one of history's most poetic twists. Some saw it as proof that genius transcends nationality. Others viewed it as redemption, an act of creation that balanced the destruction unleashed by his homeland. Schmood himself would likely have rejected such grand interpretations. To him, it was simpler. He had built the best airplane he could, because that was what engineers were meant to do. Today, every time a P-51 Mustang takes to the air, it carries more than just the legacy of a bygone war. It carries the story of Edgar Schmood, the quiet man who believed that if something looked right, it would fly right, and who proved that belief on a scale that changed history. When its engine roars and its wings catch the light, it speaks in the language of wind and motion, the same language Schmood spent his life trying to perfect. And somewhere, one imagines, if he could see it now, he would simply smile and whisper what he always knew: still beautiful. When historians look back on the Second World War, they often point to grand strategies, famous generals, and monumental battles. But the story of the P-51 Mustang reminds us that sometimes the course of history can be changed not by armies, but by ideas, by lines drawn on paper in a small workshop, by a man who believed that perfection was possible even under impossible conditions. The Mustang was born not from abundance, but from scarcity, of time, of resources, of certainty. And yet it emerged as one of the most extraordinary achievements of human ingenuity ever to grace the skies. In the decades that followed, scholars and enthusiasts tried to capture what made the Mustang so special. They examined its engineering, its performance data, its production history. They wrote books and documentaries about its role in securing Allied air superiority. But what fascinated them most was the paradox at its core, that such a machine, so deadly, so efficient, could also be so profoundly beautiful. The P-51 was, in many ways, a contradiction made manifest. It was built for destruction, yet it embodied grace. It was a tool of war that inspired peace. And at the center of that paradox stood Edgar Schmood, the man who had designed it not as a weapon, but as a work of art that happened to fly. To understand Schmood's mindset, one must return to those formative years before the war, to the Germany of his youth. It was a country steeped in engineering excellence, a place where craftsmanship and precision were part of the national character. But it was also a place increasingly consumed by ideology and control. Schmood's decision to leave Germany was not merely a career move, it was an act of freedom. He wanted to design, to create, to build without fear of political intrusion. When he arrived in America, he found not just opportunity, but belonging. The wide-open skies of California, the boundless ambition of the U.S. aviation industry, it was everything a dreamer like him could hope for. In that sense, the Mustang was as much a product of the American spirit as it was of Schmood's genius. It was what happened when freedom and intellect met in perfect harmony. By the time the Mustang entered mass production, Schmood's team had refined every element to near perfection. The aircraft's design was so efficient that it could cruise long distances with minimal fuel, yet instantly unleash power when needed. It was aerodynamic poetry, an aircraft that felt light but struck like lightning. The pilots who flew it spoke of an almost telepathic connection, as though the plane responded before they consciously issued commands. In combat, this responsiveness saved lives. The Mustang could dive faster than most enemy aircraft without losing control. Its roll rate was astonishingly smooth, allowing quick maneuvers even at high speed. And then there was the sound, that unmistakable whine of the Merlin engine. Veterans described it as haunting, exhilarating, and oddly comforting all at once. It became the soundtrack of liberation, echoing over war-torn Europe as Allied bombers and their escorts swept toward Germany. To civilians on the ground, hearing that sound meant hope. It meant that the tide of war was turning. Schmood himself once said that he designed the Mustang not just to fly well, but to feel alive. That feeling, that sense of vitality, was no accident. He studied the natural world, birds, fish, even how air moved around leaves in the wind, and incorporated those patterns into his designs. The result was an aircraft that looked organic, almost alive in motion. This biomimicry, though the term didn't yet exist, gave the Mustang its uncanny grace. Schmood had found a way to make metal behave like nature. The Mustang's role in history, of course, extended far beyond its beauty. It played a decisive role in winning air superiority over Europe. By the end of the war, it had destroyed over 4,900 enemy aircraft in the air and countless more on the ground. Bomber losses fell dramatically once the P-51 entered service. Allied airmen, once fearful of deep raids into Germany, began to trust that they could return home. The skies that had once been dominated by the Luftwaffe now belonged to the Allies, a reversal that many historians credit directly to the Mustang's arrival. But numbers alone cannot capture its legacy. The Mustang represented something deeper, the triumph of creative engineering over fear, of collaboration over isolation. British and American cooperation had fused two technologies, the Merlin engine and the Mustang airframe, into one masterpiece. And at the center of it, a German-born engineer had orchestrated the union. It was as though the very forces of division and nationalism that had torn the world apart were being quietly defied by the genius of design. After the war, Schmood rarely spoke of the Mustang's military victories. He was far more interested in its technical innovations and its lessons for future engineers. He would tell students that every aircraft is a compromise between conflicting demands, speed versus range, strength versus weight, power versus control. The trick, he said, was to find the balance that nature herself would approve of. You cannot cheat the air, he warned. It knows what is right. To him, that was the ultimate truth of aerodynamics. What made Schmood remarkable wasn't just his brilliance, but his humility. He never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a servant of the craft, someone who listened to the air, who let the laws of physics guide his pencil. He once told a reporter that designing an airplane was like composing music. You don't invent notes, you arrange them so they sing. And the Mustang, he said, was his greatest symphony. Even after his death, those who worked with him continued to feel his influence. His design philosophy shaped not only future aircraft, but future designers. The idea that an airplane should look right became a guiding principle across the industry. In many ways, that simple belief anticipated the modern concept of human-centered design, the understanding that form and function are inseparable, that beauty is not decoration but performance refined to its purest expression. Every so often, when a P-51 takes off today, pilots still speak of its peculiar magic. The plane is stable, yet spirited, obedient, yet fierce. It seems to embody the contradiction of its creator, a man of order who loved the unpredictable. And perhaps that is why the Mustang endures, while so many of its contemporaries have faded into history. It is more than the sum of its parts. It is the embodiment of an idea that precision, imagination, and courage can coexist in a single form. As modern fighter jets streak across the sky, their complex systems guided by computers, the P-51 remains refreshingly human. It reminds us of a time when machines were extensions of their pilots, when the boundary between man and metal blurred into something almost spiritual. And at the center of that memory stands Edgar Schmood, quiet, meticulous, and brilliant, the man who dared to believe that even in war, there was room for beauty. The deeper one delves into the story of the P-51 Mustang, the clearer it becomes that its creation was as much a human drama as it was an engineering triumph. It began with a promise, 120 days to design and build a fighter from scratch, and within that narrow window, a group of men led by Edgar Schmood defied the odds. They didn't have the luxury of time or the security of precedent. What they had was conviction, the belief that great things could be accomplished when imagination met necessity. That belief became the foundation of the Mustang's legacy and a defining moment in the history of aviation. When historians later analyzed how North American aviation accomplished such a feat, they often pointed to Schmood's leadership style. He wasn't loud or domineering. He led through precision and example. His colleagues described him as a man who could look at a blueprint for only a few seconds and spot inconsistencies others had missed for days. He had what they called an engineer's intuition, a sense for when something would fly well and when it wouldn't. He trusted math, but he also trusted instinct, that mysterious sixth sense born from years of experience and an intimate relationship with the air itself. One of the most fascinating aspects of Schmood's approach was how he balanced artistry and discipline. He didn't see design as a rigid process of calculation. He saw it as a conversation with nature. He often compared airflow to water, describing how it must be allowed to flow freely, how resistance could be guided, but never forced. If you fight the air, he said, you lose. You must persuade it. This philosophy was evident in every line of the Mustang. Its smooth curves, its slender fuselage, its low-drag canopy, all were shaped not to conquer the air, but to cooperate with it. That mindset, part science, part poetry, made Schmood a rare kind of engineer. He didn't fit neatly into the categories of his time. In an age of assembly lines and mass production, he remained an artist of the old school, crafting harmony from metal and mathematics. It was this unique blend of traits that allowed the Mustang to transcend its era. While other planes were built merely to meet specifications, the Mustang seemed to exceed them naturally, as if its very shape anticipated what pilots would demand before they even took to the sky. By the end of World War II, the Mustang had become the defining symbol of Allied air power. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a statement of what could happen when innovation was freed from constraint. Yet the irony at the heart of its story never faded, that a German-born engineer had given the Allies one of their greatest weapons. When asked about that irony, Schmood always dismissed the politics of it. "I worked for the side that believed in freedom," he said. "That was enough for me." His loyalty wasn't to flags but to principles, precision, integrity, and the pursuit of excellence. For the pilots who flew the Mustang, Schmood's name became synonymous with trust. They spoke of him with reverence, calling him the man who saved us from gravity. Some even wrote to him personally after the war, thanking him for his design. One letter, preserved in an aviation museum, reads, "Mr. Schmood, I never met you, but I flew your airplane. It felt like it knew me. I owe my life to that feeling." Those words, simple but heartfelt, captured what countless others felt. the deep, unspoken bond between creator and creation. It is easy, in hindsight, to see the P-51 as inevitable, as if it were destined to exist. But in truth, its birth was a series of near miracles. The decision to abandon the P-40 license agreement, the success of the radical laminar flow wing, the discovery that the Merlin engine would transform its potential, each of these moments could have gone another way. Had even one variable failed, the Mustang might have been forgotten, a footnote in the archives of wartime prototypes. Instead, every risk paid off. It's tempting to call it luck, but those who worked under Schmood would argue otherwise. "He made his own luck," said one of his colleagues. "He saw possibilities no one else did." Perhaps that is the essence of genius, the ability to recognize opportunity where others see only obstacles. Schmood's genius was not the eccentric brilliance of a dreamer detached from reality. It was the steady, disciplined genius of a man who knew how to turn dreams into blueprints and blueprints into flight. He worked within constraints but never let them define him. When told that something was impossible, he simply nodded and replied, "Then we must prove it possible." The P-51's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped how nations thought about air power. The concept of the long-range escort fighter, a plane that could accompany bombers deep into enemy territory, became a cornerstone of modern aerial strategy. The Mustang proved that range, speed, and agility could coexist, that no single compromise had to dominate the design. This principle carried over into the jet age, influencing fighters like the F-86 Sabre and even modern aircraft that still balance endurance with performance. In that sense, Schmood's fingerprints are etched into every generation of fighter that followed. But for all its technical brilliance, what kept the Mustang alive in memory was emotion. It inspired love, not just respect, but affection, from those who built it, flew it, and even fought against it. German pilots, too, admitted admiration for the Mustang. One Luftwaffe ace interviewed years after the war called it a masterpiece. "When we saw them coming," he said, "we knew we were in trouble, but even then, I couldn't help but admire how clean it looked. It was the airplane we wished we had." That statement, coming from an adversary, would have pleased Schmood. He believed that good design transcended conflict. To him, the ultimate compliment was not victory, but beauty recognized, even by an enemy. He often said, "When they copy you, you have done your job well." Indeed, post-war aircraft across the world borrowed from the Mustang's lines, its wing geometry, and its aerodynamic philosophy. It was not just an airplane, it was a template. As the decades passed, the P-51's legend grew into something mythic. Air shows turned its roar into theater, documentaries turned its battles into epic tales, and model builders turned its shape into an enduring symbol of ingenuity. Even those born generations after the war could recognize it instantly. That long nose, those elliptical wings, that distinctive canopy glinting in the sun. It became a visual shorthand for courage, craftsmanship, and the human hunger to conquer the impossible. And perhaps that, above all, is the Mustang's true legacy. It was born in a moment of crisis, crafted by minds under immense pressure, and refined by a man who believed in perfection not for glory, but for its own sake. It was proof that even in war, perhaps especially in war, humanity's best qualities can emerge: creativity, cooperation, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. As the 20th century progressed, the P-51 Mustang evolved from a weapon of war into an artifact of inspiration. It came to symbolize more than just military victory. It represented the human capacity to dream, to build, and to rise above adversity. Its story continued to echo through museums, airfields, and classrooms, a timeless lesson on how vision and courage can turn impossibility into reality. And at the heart of that story remained the quiet figure of Edgar Schmood, whose unassuming brilliance had shaped one of the most beautiful machines ever created. By the 1990s, the Mustang had become one of the most sought-after warbirds in the world. Collectors and restorers scoured old airfields, barns, and scrapyards, searching for remnants of the legendary fighter. Some aircraft were painstakingly rebuilt from fragments, piece by piece, their restorations taking years. Each rivet was polished, each curve lovingly recreated. When the engines finally roared back to life, it was as if history itself had awakened. Airshow audiences stood in silence at the sound, a low, throaty growl that climbed into a clear, piercing whistle. It was the sound of the Merlin, the voice of a generation returning from memory to reality. The renewed fascination with the P-51 also reignited interest in the people who made it possible. Historians unearthed company records, blueprints, and personal correspondence from North American aviation. Through these documents, a portrait of Schmood emerged that was richer and more complex than ever before. He was meticulous to the point of obsession, but he was also deeply empathetic. He cared about the pilots who would fly his aircraft, often consulting test pilots personally to understand what they needed in combat. He wasn't designing for statistics, he was designing for survival. "A fighter," he once said, "should be like a glove that fits the pilot's hand." This attention to the human experience of flying was part of what made the Mustang unique. Many aircraft of the era were technical marvels, but physically demanding to operate. The Mustang, by contrast, felt intuitive. It offered power without punishment, precision without strain. Schmood often said that an airplane should inspire confidence, not fear. That philosophy created a fighter that pilots loved, not just respected. Even today, in an age of fly-by-wire systems and computerized stability, the Mustang's balance and responsiveness remain almost unmatched. Modern engineers still study its design for insight. The laminar flow wing, once radical, is now a standard reference in aerodynamics courses. The Meredith effect radiator, that subtle innovation turning heat into thrust, is still admired for its elegance. Every element of the Mustang, from its flush rivets to its canopy placement, reflects a mastery of airflow that few designers have ever equaled. It was engineering stripped of ego. Nothing was added that didn't need to be there, and nothing necessary was ever sacrificed. Schmood used to say that the hardest part of design was knowing when to stop adding. Perfection, he said, is achieved not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. The plane's endurance as a cultural symbol also speaks to something deeper, its ability to represent both the brutality and the brilliance of humanity. It was, after all, a machine of war, responsible for destruction as well as salvation. Yet its beauty endures precisely because it transcends that origin. The Mustang reminds us that even in times of chaos, art and science can unite to create something magnificent. Its lines, its proportions, and its sound continue to evoke awe, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it revealed, the boundless potential of human imagination. Pilots who fly restored Mustangs today often describe a spiritual experience. They talk about the smell of fuel and oil, the vibration under their hands, the way the horizon seems to expand as the wheels leave the ground. Many say it feels like connecting with ghosts, the thousands of young men who once flew these same machines into danger, guided by trust in their creators and in themselves. "When you fly a Mustang," one modern pilot said, "you're flying history. You're part of a story that started long before you were born." That continuity, that unbroken thread from Schmood's drafting table to the skies of today, gives the Mustang its immortality. In a broader sense, Schmood's work embodies the evolution of human creativity itself. He lived through a century defined by technological revolution, from the biplanes of his youth to the dawn of spaceflight. And yet, through all that change, he held fast to a simple truth. Good design is timeless. Whether in a piston-engine fighter or a spacecraft, the principles of balance, efficiency, and grace never lose relevance. That's why the P-51 still feels modern. Its shape doesn't look antique, it looks right. It's as though Schmood had glimpsed a universal law of design and captured it in aluminum. Over time, the Mustang also became a bridge between generations. Veterans who once flew them began passing their knowledge to younger aviators. They taught not just how to operate the airplane, but how to respect it, how to understand its moods, its limits, its personality. In hangars across the world, gray-haired pilots stood beside eager students, their voices filled with both pride and reverence. "Listen to her," they would say. "She'll tell you what she wants." In those moments, the Mustang became more than history. It became legacy made tangible, a living connection between past and future. There is also something poetic in how the Mustang, a product of war, has become an ambassador of peace. Air shows where they perform draw crowds not to celebrate destruction, but to marvel at human achievement. The aircraft that once roared across enemy skies now dances in graceful loops and rolls before cheering audiences. Its sound, once a harbinger of battle, now carries a note of harmony. It's as though the machine itself has found redemption, its fierce heart transformed into a voice of remembrance. And in that redemption lies the enduring irony of Schmood's story. The engineer who fled Germany to find freedom in America ended up creating the very aircraft that would help defeat the tyranny he escaped. He didn't fight with guns or bombs, but with equations and vision. His weapon was intellect, and his victory was beauty. Few lives demonstrate more clearly how creation can triumph over destruction, or how art can emerge from the crucible of war. When people today look at the Mustang gleaming under the sun, they don't see politics or ideology. They see a symbol of possibility, proof that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can still reach upward, can still find a way to soar. And perhaps that is what Schmood wanted all along. The story of Edgar Schmood and the P-51 Mustang is one of those rare intersections of fate where timing, talent, and necessity converge. It was never meant to happen. Not the project, not the deadline, not even the man himself. Yet somehow, through a web of coincidences and impossible demands, the pieces aligned. In that alignment, the world witnessed not just the creation of a revolutionary aircraft, but the embodiment of what can happen when vision is given just enough room to breathe. When Schmood first began sketching the outlines of the Mustang, the world was at a breaking point. The skies over Europe were filled with fire, and Britain was fighting for its very survival. Across the Atlantic, the United States still stood apart, uncertain whether to join the conflict. In that fragile balance, the British approached North American aviation with a simple request: build the Curtiss P-40 under license. But Schmood, who had a restless imagination and a stubborn faith in his own ideas, saw an opportunity to do something better. It was a gamble so audacious it bordered on reckless. Designing a completely new aircraft from scratch in less than 4 months seemed absurd. But that's precisely what he proposed. The team that gathered around him at North American Aviation became one of the most dedicated groups in the history of engineering. They worked day and night, sleeping on cots in the factory, fueled by coffee and conviction. They were driven not by fame or money, but by the sheer thrill of creating something extraordinary. Schmood's leadership was quiet but absolute. He didn't raise his voice or make grand speeches. Instead, he inspired through precision, by solving problems with elegance, by knowing when to push and when to pause. Every engineer in that room felt they were part of something historic, even if they didn't yet know what it would become. When the first prototype, the NA-73X, rolled out of the hangar in September 1940, it looked unlike anything else in the sky. Sleek, compact, and perfectly balanced, it seemed to radiate confidence. Test pilot Vance Breeze climbed into the cockpit, taxied to the runway, and lifted off into history. The moment the wheels left the ground, the Mustang proved that it wasn't just another airplane, it was a revelation. Reporters described it as the smoothest fighter ever built, and even the notoriously critical British test pilots were astonished. Its range, handling, and speed were unprecedented. But the real transformation came when the British fitted the airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was one of those moments when two halves of genius found each other. The American airframe, optimized for aerodynamics, met the British engine, renowned for its power and reliability. Together, they created a machine that could fly farther, faster, and higher than anything the Axis powers could field. Schmood himself admitted that when he first saw the Merlin-powered version in flight, it felt almost unreal, as though the aircraft had finally become what it was always meant to be. The Mustang entered combat and immediately began rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. Before its arrival, Allied bombers had suffered devastating losses deep inside Germany. Escorts like the Spitfire and P-47 Thunderbolt couldn't reach that far. Their fuel tanks simply ran dry. But the Mustang could go all the way to Berlin and back. It became the bomber's guardian angel, sleek, swift, and deadly. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned to fear its silhouette on the horizon. "When the Mustangs come," one German ace reportedly said, "the war is over." Every great machine carries the fingerprints of its maker, and the Mustang carried Schmood's in every detail. The long nose gave it both aerodynamic efficiency and unmistakable style. The bubble canopy provided visibility unmatched by any fighter of the time. Even the radiator scoop, a potential source of drag, was turned into a source of thrust through the clever application of thermodynamics. It was as if every potential flaw had been transformed into an advantage. Schmood's genius wasn't that he avoided problems, it was that he turned them into solutions. As the war drew to a close, the Mustang's legend was sealed. It had become the quintessential symbol of Allied air power, escorting bombers by day and hunting enemy fighters by dusk. The pilots who flew it swore by its capabilities. "It flew like it wanted to win," one veteran said. Another described it as the perfect extension of my will. Those were not technical assessments. They were confessions of love. For men who had stared death in the face, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a companion, a guardian, and sometimes a savior. After the war, Schmood could have retired as a hero, but that wasn't his way. He continued to design, always searching for refinement. When asked why he kept working, he smiled and said, "Because the air still has secrets." That answer reveals everything about him. For Schmood, flight was not just physics, it was philosophy. The sky was an endless problem to solve, and every solution revealed another mystery. His curiosity never dimmed, even as technology evolved beyond the propeller-driven world he had mastered. The irony, of course, is that Schmood's masterpiece was forged in the fires of conflict, a product of destruction that came to symbolize peace. That contradiction haunted and inspired generations of engineers after him. The P-51 proved that war, for all its horror, could sometimes accelerate progress in ways that peace alone could not. It was a reminder that human creativity often burns brightest under pressure when failure is not an option. Even in death, Schmood's legacy refused to fade. His name may not be as famous as the generals or politicians of his era, but among pilots and engineers, it carries a reverence reserved for the greats. To them, he is not just a historical figure, he is the embodiment of the engineer's creed: to imagine, to build, and to never stop striving for perfection. Today, the Mustang endures as a living monument to that spirit. It appears in films, museums, and air shows not as a relic, but as a living presence. Each time its Merlin engine roars to life, it's as though Schmood himself has returned for a brief moment, smiling quietly from the clouds, watching the thing he built do what it was born to do: fly. And perhaps that's the truest measure of success, not medals or monuments, but the simple fact that something you created still moves people, still flies, still inspires awe decades later. The P-51 does all of that and more. It reminds us that human limits are often illusions, that the impossible is only a challenge waiting for courage. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang stretches far beyond its wartime achievements. It is, at its core, a story about transformation, how something born for conflict could come to represent harmony, ingenuity, and timeless beauty. Each rivet, each curve, and each roar of its engine tells a story not just of technological mastery, but of humanity's unrelenting drive to defy limits. In the years after World War II, when the world was weary of battle and searching for peace, the Mustang found a new purpose. It became a teaching tool, a research platform, and a symbol of innovation that transcended its origins. The U.S. Air Force, universities, and aerospace companies all used the Mustang for aerodynamic studies, refining theories that would lead to the jet age. Its laminar flow wing, once a revolutionary experiment, became a cornerstone in modern aerodynamics, the foundation upon which future generations of aircraft were built. Even as jets replaced propellers, the Mustang's influence remained visible. The elegant lines of the F-86 Sabre, the first American jet to dominate the skies during the Korean War, echoed the Mustang's proportions. Schmood's design philosophy had become gospel. If it looks right, it flies right. Those 6 words became a mantra repeated across design departments worldwide. They weren't about aesthetics, they were about truth. An airplane that looked right was one that obeyed the natural laws of flight, one that flowed through the air instead of fighting it. This principle continues to shape aviation even in the 21st century. From stealth fighters to space planes, the DNA of Schmood's thinking is still present. Every time an engineer trims excess weight, smooths a surface, or balances performance with efficiency, they're echoing his method. His belief that function and beauty are inseparable has become a universal truth of design, not only in aircraft but in architecture, automobiles, and even software. The Mustang didn't just change how planes were built, it changed how people thought about creation itself. The emotional pull of the Mustang also endures in ways no one could have predicted. For the pilots who flew it, the plane became a lifelong companion, a memory carved into their souls. Many of them continued to fly Mustangs in private life, joining air races and reunions. Others couldn't bear to part with the memory of its controls beneath their hands. One veteran pilot interviewed in the 1980s said, "When I dream of flying, it's always in the Mustang. I can still feel the stick, the vibration, the sound in my chest. It's more than memory. It's a heartbeat. That heartbeat resonates with new generations too. Younger pilots, some born decades after the war, fall in love with the Mustang, not out of nostalgia, but out of pure admiration. They see in it a kind of purity that modern technology sometimes lacks, a machine that demands skill, respect, and a personal connection. Flying a Mustang isn't just operating an aircraft, it's participating in history. Every takeoff feels like a handshake across time, a dialogue between those who built it and those who keep it alive. There's a particular magic in seeing a P-51 up close. The way light glints off its polished skin, the way its wingtips curve like the edges of a blade, the way the nose seems to stretch endlessly forward. It feels less like a machine and more like a living creature, resting between flights. When the engine starts, that illusion becomes complete. The deep, rumbling growl rises into a piercing, metallic howl, and for a moment, the air itself seems to tremble. It's an experience that defies words, a reminder that sound, motion, and memory can combine into something transcendent. To understand why the Mustang still holds such emotional power, one must understand the man who shaped it. Edgar Schmood wasn't just an engineer, he was a storyteller in metal. He believed that every line of an aircraft should communicate something, that its form should reveal its purpose. To him, design wasn't decoration, it was expression. And the Mustang's expression was unmistakable. Confidence, elegance, and a quiet kind of defiance. His life, too, carried that same quiet defiance. He had fled a country that prized obedience and found freedom in one that valued imagination. He had turned his back on the ideology that sought domination and instead contributed to the fight for liberation. It's fitting, then, that the aircraft he designed became one of the key instruments in that victory, and that it went on to symbolize peace and unity in the years that followed. Historians often say that the P-51 was the right plane at the right time, but that phrase underestimates what really happened. It wasn't just timing, it was vision. Schmood and his team created something that the moment demanded, yes, but they also created something that time itself could not diminish. Few inventions from that era have aged so gracefully. The Mustang doesn't look like a relic of the 1940s. It looks timeless, as if it could have rolled out of a hangar yesterday. That's the mark of true design genius, to create something so balanced that it transcends its era entirely. Perhaps the most poetic aspect of the Mustang story is how it bridges opposites. It was conceived in war but lives on in peace. It was built from the cooperation of nations once divided, and it was designed by a man whose heritage spanned both sides of the conflict it helped end. In that sense, the P-51 is more than an airplane. It's a symbol of reconciliation. It shows that creation can emerge from destruction, that innovation knows no borders, and that beauty can grow even from the ashes of war. In later years, as Schmood's name began to fade from public memory, the aircraft itself ensured he was never forgotten. Every Mustang that flew carried a piece of him, his eye for proportion, his understanding of air, his relentless pursuit of rightness. Pilots, restorers, and historians became his torchbearers. They didn't just preserve his work, they preserved his philosophy. In hangars and museums around the world, the words, "If it looks right, it flies right," are still spoken like a quiet prayer. The P-51's presence today is almost spiritual. It's not simply admired, it's revered. For many, it embodies the best of what humanity can achieve when vision is guided by purpose. It's a reminder that even amid chaos, there can be grace. And for every person who watches one climb toward the clouds, leaving a silver trail in the sunlight, there's a moment of understanding. That flight, in its purest form, is both art and faith. The story of the P-51 Mustang isn't just about the machine, it's about what it meant. To the world, it was a weapon. To its pilots, it was a guardian angel. To its designer, it was proof that imagination, when combined with discipline, could defy every boundary placed before it. But to history, it became something far greater, a metaphor for the human condition itself, flawed, daring, beautiful, and unstoppable, once it takes flight. By the late 20th century, the Mustang had long outlived its original purpose, yet its legacy seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Restored Mustangs continue to perform at air shows, appearing not as relics but as living legends. Children who had never known war stood in awe as the aircraft roared overhead, their eyes wide and their imaginations ignited. For many, that was their first true experience of wonder, a glimpse of humanity's endless hunger for the sky. At aviation museums across the world, visitors still pause before the gleaming fuselage of a P-51, reading the plaques that detail its specifications: maximum speed, service ceiling, range, engine type. But those cold numbers never capture its essence. What they can't explain is how this airplane makes people feel. They can't quantify the lump in the throat when that Merlin engine starts, or the way hearts race as the plane climbs and banks in the sunlight. The Mustang doesn't just represent history, it revives it. It turns memory into motion, even for engineers. Working with the most advanced aircraft today, there's a kind of humility when studying the Mustang. They see in it a purity of purpose that's increasingly rare in modern design. Every component of the P-51 was created with one intention: to make it fly better. There was no excess, no vanity. Every detail served the air, not the ego. Schmood had a saying that airplanes don't care about opinions. The air, he would remind his team, doesn't respond to what you think should work. It responds only to what does. That quiet pragmatism, guided by beauty, became his signature. He didn't design for applause, yet applause found him anyway. The Mustang, in many ways, became his biography written in aluminum. It reflected his character: precise, disciplined, modest, but with a hidden streak of boldness that appeared at exactly the right moment. He once told a journalist that designing an airplane was a conversation with physics, and that, if you listen carefully enough, it will tell you what it wants to be. The Mustang, then, was the result of one of history's greatest conversations. For those who flew it, the Mustang became more than a weapon or a tool. It was almost a companion. Pilots often described it in human terms, as though it had moods and emotions. They said it forgave mistakes, encouraged confidence, and felt alive in a way no other fighter did. When a pilot climbed into a Mustang, he wasn't just taking control of a machine, he was joining forces with it. The aircraft's responsiveness created a feedback loop between man and metal, one so intuitive that it blurred the line between pilot and plane. That connection produced moments of incredible heroism. There are countless stories of Mustang pilots who risked their lives to protect bomber crews, diving through flak and enemy fire to chase away attackers. They called themselves the Little Friends, the escorts who would never abandon their big friends, the bombers. Those friendships between men in the sky were forged in fire, but the Mustang made them possible. It had the range, the endurance, and the heart to see the mission through. In the archives of wartime letters, there are hundreds of notes from bomber crews thanking the Mustang pilots who saved them. One reads, "When the P-51s showed up, we breathed again. They followed us all the way home. We never saw courage like that." Those letters, filled with gratitude and relief, testify to how deeply the Mustang changed the psychology of war. It gave hope where before there had been fear. As peace returned, the Mustang found new missions. Some became racers, some trainers, others museum pieces. But even stripped of its guns, it never lost its power to stir the soul. A P-51 could sit silent in a hangar for decades and still command respect, as if its very shape radiated memory. When its engine finally came to life again, the air around it seemed to wake up too. It's hard to explain, but anyone who's witnessed a Mustang start will understand. It's not just mechanical, it's emotional. In the 21st century, the Mustang's fame only intensified. Movies, documentaries, and even video games introduced it to new audiences. But what's remarkable is how its reputation never became nostalgic in the shallow sense. It wasn't seen as a relic from a simpler time. It was revered as something timeless, a design so perfect that it transcended decades. Even people who had no interest in airplanes could recognize it, as if the human brain itself instinctively understood that its shape was right. That sense of rightness, of harmony between form and function, is what makes the Mustang stand apart. You could look at 100 different aircraft and instantly pick out the P-51. Its long nose, its slightly set-back cockpit, the delicate curve of its wings. They all speak a visual language of speed and grace. Schmood once said that an airplane should look eager to fly even when it's standing still, and indeed the Mustang does. Even at rest, it looks poised, ready to leap skyward at the faintest whisper of the throttle. There's a story told by one pilot who restored a Mustang decades after the war. When he finished the final polish and rolled it out of the hangar, he said it felt as if the airplane itself was grateful, as if it knew it had been brought back to life. That kind of reverence isn't given to machines easily. It's earned through a combination of performance, history, and something intangible: soul. And somehow, this airplane, designed under impossible pressure by a German immigrant in California, has more soul than almost any machine ever built. Schmood never claimed credit for that. When asked late in life whether he thought the Mustang was perfect, he shook his head. "Perfection doesn't exist," he said. "But the Mustang came close enough that I stopped trying to improve it." Those who knew him said that was as close as he ever came to bragging. In that humility lies another part of his legacy: the idea that greatness doesn't come from chasing glory but from chasing excellence for its own sake. Schmood didn't design to win fame or fortune. He designed because he loved flight. That love became the Mustang's fuel, burning invisibly behind every takeoff and every roar of its engine. And so the P-51 continues to fly, not just in air shows or museums, but in the hearts of those who believe that beauty and function can coexist, that art and science can share the same sky. Every time a Mustang takes off, the dream begins anew. If one were to chart the life of Edgar Schmood, it would read like a journey through the very evolution of flight itself. Born at the dawn of the 20th century, when airplanes were fragile novelties made of wood and wire, he lived to see men walk on the moon. He began his career with propellers and ended it in the age of jet turbines and supersonic speeds. Yet, through every leap of technology, his core philosophy never changed: that good design is timeless, and that beauty, when born of purpose, will always endure. In many ways, Schmood's story mirrors that of the century he lived in. It began in turmoil, rose through innovation, and ended in reflection. He was a man who saw both the worst and the best of what humanity could achieve. He had witnessed war's destruction firsthand, yet he devoted his life to creation. The P-51 Mustang stands as his greatest contradiction: a machine of war that became a symbol of peace, a product of necessity that became an icon of art. Even today, when aerospace technology has advanced beyond what Schmood could have imagined, his influence remains deeply embedded in design culture. The Mustang's legacy continues not just in the world of aviation, but in the way creators across disciplines think about the relationship between form and function. Architects, automotive designers, even filmmakers have cited the P-51 as an influence, not because they build airplanes, but because they recognize in it the universal language of elegance born from efficiency. That's the thing about the Mustang. It transcends category. It's more than a fighter plane. It's an idea, the idea that if something is made with care, clarity, and courage, it can become immortal. And immortality is precisely what the Mustang achieved. Over 80 years after its first flight, hundreds still soar in perfect working condition. Restorers treat them like sacred relics, pouring thousands of hours into each rebuild. They know they're not just fixing a machine, they're preserving a story. At every major air show, when a formation of Mustangs takes to the sky, there's a collective hush that falls over the crowd. It's not just the sound, though that throaty rising song of the Merlin engine still sends chills down the spine. It's the sight. The sunlight catches on the wings just so, the silhouettes stretch across the blue, and for a brief moment, time folds in on itself. You can almost imagine the ghosts of those young pilots from 1944 smiling down, their spirits carried aloft by the same wind that once roared through their cockpits. And somewhere, beyond history, beyond memory, one imagines Edgar Schmood watching too, not as a proud engineer basking in accomplishment, but as a craftsman quietly satisfied that what he built still flies, that it still means something. That is perhaps the truest reward any creator can ask for: to know that their work outlived them, not as a monument, but as a living thing that continues to inspire. When people study the P-51 today, they're often struck by how ahead of its time it was. Even the smallest details reveal foresight that borders on prophetic. The wing design that minimized drag, the placement of the canopy for visibility, the way the radiator scoop was integrated for aerodynamic benefit. All these features, prefigured technologies that would dominate the jet age. Schmood had built not just an aircraft, but a philosophy of flight that would guide generations. He proved that progress isn't just about adding more power or complexity. Sometimes it's about simplicity, refined to perfection. One could argue that the P-51 Mustang represents the last great age of analog flight, the point at which machines were still ruled by the human touch. Pilots had no computers, no digital instruments, no fly-by-wire systems to protect them. Their survival depended on instinct, training, and trust in their aircraft. That trust was the ultimate measure of Schmood's success. The Mustang gave pilots confidence, not the reckless kind, but the kind that comes from knowing your machine is as capable as you are. When pilots today describe flying a Mustang, they often speak in terms of emotion rather than performance. They talk about how it feels alive, how it talks back, how every movement of the controls feels natural, like a conversation rather than a command. That harmony between man and machine is what Schmood sought all along. He wanted pilots to feel that the airplane was not resisting them but collaborating with them. In that sense, he didn't just design an aircraft, he designed an experience. The Mustang also stands as a testament to collaboration between nations. Without the British, there would have been no Merlin engine. Without the Americans, no manufacturing scale or daring engineering. And at the center of it all stood a German-born engineer whose mind transcended borders. It's hard to imagine a more poetic symbol of unity, a plane that combined the genius of three nations to help liberate the world from tyranny. The Mustang didn't just win battles, it proved that cooperation could achieve miracles where division had failed. For Schmood, that was perhaps the most meaningful irony of all. His life was proof that ideas have no nationality. Genius, like flight, belongs to everyone. He often said that airplanes were the language of the sky, and the Mustang spoke that language fluently. It didn't matter who built it or who flew it. Once it was in the air, it became universal. And that universality, that ability to connect people through beauty and function, is what has given the Mustang its immortality. When it flies over modern crowds, it's not a symbol of conquest or destruction. It's a symbol of possibility. It's a reminder that even when the world tears itself apart, there are still those who build things meant to lift us higher. The story of Edgar Schmood and his impossible design teaches us something profound, that innovation doesn't come from certainty. It comes from doubt, from risk, from the willingness to chase an idea that others call impossible. Schmood didn't have time, resources, or guarantees. What he had was vision and the courage to act on it. And through that courage, he gave the world not just a machine, but a miracle. As the last echoes of the Second World War faded, the world entered an age that prized peace, yet could never quite forget the machines that had fought to preserve it. The P-51 Mustang became one of those paradoxical relics, born of necessity, sustained by admiration. In peacetime, it became an ambassador of courage, a reminder that greatness can emerge from crisis, and that creation, even under pressure, can produce something eternal. Edgar Schmood lived long enough to witness that transformation. He attended air shows where Mustangs, freshly restored and glistening under the sun, flew in tight formation. He watched young pilots, born decades after the war, step into cockpits once occupied by heroes. They looked to him with awe, but he would simply nod, modest and reserved. He didn't see himself as a legend. He saw himself as an engineer who had done his job well. "If you make something right," he once said quietly to a journalist, "it will speak for itself." The Mustang spoke louder than any words he could ever have uttered. By the time of his death in 1987, Schmood had left behind more than a legacy of aircraft. He had left a philosophy, a way of thinking about invention that fused discipline with daring. He believed that the perfect design wasn't a stroke of genius, but the sum of countless small decisions made with care. Every line drawn, every bolt tightened, every curve refined. Each was an act of faith in the idea that perfection, though unreachable, was still worth chasing. And so, the P-51 Mustang continues to fly, carrying that philosophy across the sky. Each flight is a living memorial, not just to those who built it, but to those who trusted it with their lives. When it taxis across a runway, its propeller slicing the air with a rhythmic hum, it's as though the past itself is awakening. The sound grows, deepens, becomes a roar, and then it's airborne again, just as it was in 1940, as graceful and fearless as ever. For a few glorious moments, time bends, and the modern world falls away. Spectators often describe those moments as transcendent. They feel something stirring inside them, a mix of nostalgia, respect, and pure wonder. The P-51 doesn't belong to a single generation. It belongs to anyone who's ever looked up at the sky and dreamed of freedom. That's the secret at its core. Beneath the metal and mathematics, beneath the rivets and the roar, lies something deeply human. the longing to rise. That longing, perhaps, was Schmood's greatest inheritance. It wasn't just his technical mastery that made the Mustang possible. It was his belief that flight could be beautiful, that machines could have grace. He gave shape to an idea that humans have chased since the dawn of time, that if we can imagine something enough and work for it with precision and heart, we can make it real. In a sense, the P-51 is both artifact and allegory. It represents what humanity can do when driven by necessity, and what it can become when driven by vision. It's easy to forget, in an age of satellites and artificial intelligence, that this airplane was built with slide rules and intuition. Its creators didn't have digital models or computer simulations. They had pencils, drafting tables, and courage. And yet, they produced a masterpiece that still holds its own in the skies nearly a century later. When we look at the Mustang today, we see the best version of ourselves reflected in its polished skin. It's not perfect. Nothing made by human hands ever is. But it comes close enough to remind us why we keep trying. It embodies the paradox at the heart of progress, that beauty can be born from necessity, and that even in war there can exist moments of creation so pure they outlast the destruction around them. In classrooms and museums, children trace their fingers along its smooth fuselage, imagining what it must have felt like to fly one. Teachers tell them about the 120-day challenge, about how Schmood and his team achieved the impossible. The kids marvel, not at the war, but at the ingenuity, the speed, the audacity of it all. They see that human beings, when united by purpose, can accomplish miracles. And in that lesson lies the true legacy of the P-51 Mustang. Every generation rediscovers it in its own way. Artists paint it, filmmakers immortalize it, musicians compose scores to match its flight. It has appeared in countless films and documentaries, from black and white wartime reels to high-definition tributes, each one capturing a piece of its soul. And no matter how much technology advances, no digital creation ever seems to match the authenticity of that engine's growl, or the way sunlight slides down its wings at dusk. There's something else too, something quieter, but no less powerful. The P-51 represents reconciliation. It was built by Americans, powered by a British engine, and designed by a German mind. In an era defined by division and destruction, that collaboration became a blueprint for peace. It's proof that humanity's greatest achievements often come when we set aside fear and competition, when we choose to build together instead of apart. The same nations that once fought on opposite sides of the war would later join in alliances, their engineers working side by side. The Mustang in many ways foreshadowed that unity, and so when it slices through the clouds today, it carries more than history. It carries a message. It tells us that brilliance can emerge from chaos, that cooperation can outshine conflict, and that the human spirit, though often tested, is unbreakable. Schmood might not have said it in so many words, but his creation says it for him every time it flies. As the plane dips its wings and the engine fades into the horizon, one can imagine the closing of a perfect story arc, from impossible dream to immortal legend. It began with desperation in 1940 when the world was on the edge of collapse. It ended with triumph, not just in battle, but in meaning. The P-51 Mustang became more than the sum of its parts. It became the sound of hope, the shape of perseverance, the flight path of humanity itself. And so, in the end, the irony remains as sharp as ever. A German engineer working in America designed an aircraft that helped free Europe from tyranny. Out of destruction came creation. Out of one man's vision came victory. And out of a 120-day miracle came something that would never die. When people ask why the Mustang still matters, the answer is simple. Because it reminds us that the impossible is not a wall, it's a challenge. Schmood met that challenge with intellect and imagination, and the world has been flying higher ever since. The P-51 Mustang, conceived by a man who once fled the shadows of his homeland, forged in the fires of war, and reborn as a symbol of freedom, remains what it always was, the most beautiful irony ever to take flight.